In the years following, the Berlin Wall would become more than just a barrier. It was a symbol of division, but also of resilience and hope for reunification, which would eventually come in 1989. But on that day, in October 1961, as the tanks retreated, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that this time, diplomacy had prevailed over conflict. In August 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall had already set a tense backdrop for superpower relations. Washington, along with its British and French allies, had failed to prevent the Soviets from erecting this physical and ideological barrier, which not only divided a city but symbolized the broader division of Europe and the world into opposing blocs. Fast forward to October, and the situation had reached a critical point. Over several days, tensions had been escalating due to U.S. rebuffs of East German attempts to enforce identification checks on American officials entering East Berlin. This was not merely a matter of protocol, it was a profound question of sovereignty. The East Germans sought to assert their control, while the Americans refused to acknowledge anything but Soviet occupation authority, thus not recognizing the German Democratic Republic as a legitimate state. The scene was set on October 27th. The U.S. decided to take a bold stand. 10 M48 Patton tanks, with their diesel engines roaring, were positioned at Checkpoint Charlie. These American tanks, symbols of military might and determination, stood a mere 50 meters from the border, their engines racing, sending thick plumes of black smoke into the night air. This was a deliberate show of force, a statement that the U.S. would not back down. The response from Moscow was swift. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, approved the deployment of an equal number of Russian T-55 tanks. These tanks, with their own legacy of power and intimidation, rolled towards the border, their tracks grinding against the pavement, echoing through the quiet streets of Berlin. The tanks of both superpowers came to a halt, facing each other across the invisible line that marked the division of Berlin. They were positioned so close, just 100 meters apart, that the tension could almost be felt in the air. The guns of the tanks were uncovered, a clear sign of readiness and a chilling reminder of the potential for immediate escalation. This standoff was unprecedented. Never before had American and Soviet troops confronted each other so directly, with their military hardware at the ready, poised for conflict. The atmosphere was thick with the unspoken question of whether this would be the spark that ignited a world war. The world watched, holding its breath. News agencies scrambled to report on this dramatic face-off, and leaders in Washington and Moscow were kept abreast of every development. The situation was delicate, with any misstep potentially leading to catastrophe. In the heart of Berlin, at Checkpoint Charlie, the night was filled with the low growl of tank engines and the palpable tension of an international standoff. Here, in this small patch of land, the fate of global peace hung in the balance. The standoff continued for 16 hours, a long, drawn-out moment in history where the world stood on the brink. Each side communicated, negotiated, and waited, knowing that the next move could either de-escalate the situation or lead to an unimaginable escalation. Throughout this ordeal, the importance of diplomacy was never more apparent. The leaders on both sides understood that while military might was on display, the true battle was being fought with words, with patience, and with the understanding of the enormous stakes involved. This event at Checkpoint Charlie would become one of the most iconic moments of the Cold War, a vivid demonstration of how close the world could come to war over what might seem like minor issues, but which were, in reality, fundamental questions of power, control, and the right to exist. As the night of October 27th wore on, the atmosphere at Checkpoint Charlie was charged with an intensity that was almost tangible. The American and Soviet tanks, with their guns uncovered, stood in a silent yet deafening standoff, each side waiting for the other to make a move. The situation had escalated from a simple diplomatic dispute over identification checks into a symbol of the broader ideological conflict of the Cold War. The Americans, under the leadership of General Lucius D. Clay, had taken a firm stand, refusing to acknowledge East German sovereignty. Their tanks at Checkpoint Charlie were not just a response to the wall, but a declaration that the U.S. would not cede ground either literally or figuratively. On the other side, the Soviets, with Nikita Khrushchev's approval, had responded in kind. The deployment of T-55 tanks was a clear message that the Soviet Union would not be intimidated or back down. This was more than just a military maneuver. It was a statement of power and resolve in the face of Western pressure. As the hours passed, the tension was not just in the physical presence of the tanks, but in the minds of the leaders and the soldiers. Every minute seemed to stretch, each second filled with the potential for disaster. The soldiers on both sides, many of whom had never seen combat, were now participants in a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. Diplomats and military leaders were in constant communication, trying to navigate through this crisis. President John F. Kennedy in Washington was in touch with his advisors, understanding the gravity of the situation. On the other side, Khrushchev was also kept informed, knowing that any miscalculation could lead to an escalation neither side wanted. The standoff was not just about the tanks, it was about the people of Berlin. Families had been separated by the wall, and this military face-off was a stark reminder of the human cost of political divisions. The citizens of West Berlin watched with a mix of fear and hope, knowing that their fate was tied to these international games of power. In the midst of this tension, small acts of communication took place. American and Soviet officers, aware of the gravity of the situation, occasionally made eye contact across the border, a silent acknowledgement of the shared humanity beneath their uniforms. This was a moment where personal interactions could have profound implications. As the night deepened, the world waited, uncertain of the outcome. Would this be the spark that ignited a broader conflict, or would diplomacy find a way to de-escalate the situation? The standoff at Checkpoint Charlie was a microcosm of the Cold War itself, where small actions had the potential to lead to global consequences. The tanks remained in position, their engines idling, a constant reminder of the potential for violence. But as dawn approached, a breakthrough in communication was made. Through back-channel diplomacy, a deal was struck. The Soviets would remove their tanks if the Americans did the same, an agreement that would be the beginning of the end of this immediate crisis. Slowly, one by one, the tanks began to retreat. The American M48s pulled back first, their engines roaring one last time as they reversed away from the border. The Soviet T-55s followed suit, their movements deliberate, ensuring that the de-escalation was visible to all. As the tanks withdrew, the world exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The standoff at Checkpoint Charlie had ended without violence, but it left an indelible mark on history. It was a stark reminder of how close the world could come to war over what might seem like minor issues, but were, in reality, fundamental questions of sovereignty, ideology, and the right to self-determination. The event at Checkpoint Charlie became a symbol of the Cold War's intensity, the brinkmanship, and the delicate balance of power that characterized the era. It was a moment when the world saw how diplomacy, patience, and the understanding of the stakes involved could prevail over military might. This standoff, though resolved peacefully, highlighted the precarious nature of peace during the Cold War. It underscored the importance of communication, negotiation, and the need for leaders to understand the human element in international relations. The tanks had retreated, but the lessons from that night in October 1961 would resonate for decades to come. The night of October 27, 1961, was unlike any other in the history of the Cold War. At Checkpoint Charlie, the standoff between American and Soviet tanks had reached its zenith, with the world watching in anticipation of what might come next. The tanks, lined up in a silent but menacing array, were more than just military hardware. They were the physical manifestation of the ideological divide that had split the world. Each side, through their actions, was sending a message not just to each other, but to the world about their resolve, their willingness to defend their principles, and their readiness to confront the other if necessary. In the midst of this tension, the human element was ever present. Soldiers on both sides, many of them young men who had never seen combat, stood in their tanks, facing an adversary they had been trained to view as an enemy. Yet in this moment there was also an unspoken understanding. They were not just soldiers, they were human beings caught in the machinations of political powers far beyond their control. As the standoff continued, the role of leadership became paramount. President John F. Kennedy in Washington was deeply engaged in the crisis. He understood the implications of any action taken at Checkpoint Charlie. His advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk, were in constant communication, working to find a diplomatic solution that would de-escalate the situation without losing face. On the Soviet side, Nikita Khrushchev was also well aware of the stakes. Known for his volatile temper, he was nonetheless a pragmatist when it came to avoiding direct military confrontation with the United States. He, too, was in constant contact with his military and diplomatic advisors, seeking a way to resolve the crisis without backing down from his stance on Berlin. The tension was not confined to the military personnel at the checkpoint. In Berlin, citizens on both sides of the wall watched anxiously. Families separated by the barrier hoped against hope that this confrontation would not lead to more violence or further entrench the division of their city. As the night deepened, the situation seemed to reach a stalemate. The tanks stood, their engines idling, a constant reminder of the potential for immediate escalation. Yet, in this moment of tension, a silent negotiation was taking place. Officers on both sides, through their very presence, communicated a mutual understanding of the gravity of the situation. The breakthrough came through back-channel diplomacy, a testament to the importance of communication during crises. American and Soviet diplomats, working behind the scenes, agreed to a simultaneous withdrawal of the tanks. The agreement was simple. The Soviets would pull back if the Americans did the same, ensuring neither side could claim a victory in this standoff. The retreat was carried out with precision. The American M48 tanks, their engines roaring, began to move back first, their movements deliberate and slow, ensuring that the de-escalation was visible to all. Following suit, the Soviet T-55 tanks also started their retreat, their tracks grinding against the pavement as they moved away from the border. As the tanks withdrew, the tension that had enveloped Berlin began to dissipate. The world watched as this potential flashpoint of the Cold War ended not with gunfire, but with a diplomatic resolution. The tanks had retreated, but the lessons from that night would echo through history. The event at Checkpoint Charlie was a stark reminder of how close the world could come to war over seemingly minor disputes. It was a moment where the potential for escalation was palpable, where the fate of global peace hung in the balance over a small patch of land in Berlin. The standoff underscored several key aspects of the Cold War. Diplomacy over military might. Despite the display of military power, it was diplomacy that prevailed, highlighting the importance of communication, negotiation, and the understanding of the stakes involved. Humanity in conflict. Even in the midst of a military standoff, the human element was evident. Soldiers on both sides, though adversaries, shared a common humanity, a reminder that conflicts are often fought by individuals who might not have chosen this path. The fragility of peace. The Checkpoint Charlie incident showed how fragile peace was during the Cold War. Small actions had the potential to ignite a much larger conflict, emphasizing the need for careful management of international relations. The symbolism of Berlin. Berlin and Checkpoint Charlie in particular became symbols of the Cold War's division, but also of the hope for reunification, which would eventually come in 1989. In the years that followed, the Berlin Wall would remain a physical and psychological barrier, but the event at Checkpoint Charlie would be remembered as a moment when the world stepped back from the brink. It was a testament to the power of diplomacy, the importance of understanding, and the enduring human desire for peace over conflict.